Catherine II, known as Catherine the Great, ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796. Her reign marked one of the most influential periods in Russian history, characterized by expansion, administrative reforms, and a strong emphasis on European Enlightenment ideals. Yet beneath her progressive image, her rule also carried a legacy of absolute control and severe punishment for dissent. Born in Stettin, Prussia in 1729 as Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst, Catherine entered the Russian court through marriage to the future Emperor Peter III. Her intelligence, adaptability, and ambition quickly made her a key figure in the imperial circle. She studied Russian language, culture, and Orthodox religion, securing favor among nobles who saw her as a better alternative to her unpopular husband. In 1762, Catherine ascended to the throne following a coup that deposed Peter III. The coup was swift and bloodless, with the support of the Imperial Guard and many nobles. Once crowned Empress, Catherine positioned herself as both reformer and ruler of an expanding empire. She embraced Enlightenment philosophy, but maintained strict control over the Russian nobility and serfs alike. Her government encouraged education, science, and the arts, while her foreign policies sought to extend Russia's influence across Europe and Asia. Under her leadership, Russia gained territories in Poland, the Crimea, and along the Black Sea, solidifying its status as a major European power. Her political acumen and correspondence with thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot gave her an image of a cultured and enlightened sovereign. However, Catherine's modernization of Russia did not extend to social equality. The serfdom system grew harsher during her reign. Millions of peasants lived under extreme poverty, bound to landowners who exercised complete authority over their lives. While she introduced laws to streamline administration, her reforms favored the aristocracy, deepening class divisions. Catherine's court became a center of power and intrigue. The Russian nobility, empowered by her rule, gained privileges in exchange for loyalty. Military and political alliances were maintained through elaborate ceremonies, gifts, and appointments. Her reliance on favored courtiers and lovers, including Grigory Potemkin, helped shape her domestic and foreign policies. Potemkin, in particular, became instrumental in expanding and developing the southern provinces of the empire. Despite her Western ideals, Catherine faced growing internal instability. The empire was vast, and communication between St. Petersburg and the distant provinces was slow. Corruption and abuse of power were common among local officials. In many rural regions, the peasants saw little improvement in their lives and often associated the Empress's reforms with higher taxes and stricter laws. One of the greatest challenges to her rule came in the form of rebellion. Between 1773 and 1775, the Pugachev rebellion erupted in the Ural and Volga regions. Led by Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack who claimed to be the rightful Tsar Peter III, the revolt drew thousands of peasants, serfs, and discontented soldiers. It exposed the growing unrest among Russia's lower classes and tested Catherine's ability to maintain control over her expanding empire. Catherine's military response to the rebellion was decisive. Imperial troops crushed the revolt with efficiency and brutality. Pugachev was captured, paraded in chains, and executed in Moscow. The rebellion's suppression reinforced Catherine's authority and served as a warning to other potential insurgents. It also led to the implementation of harsher measures against treason and sedition. After the rebellion, Catherine strengthened her administrative reach across Russia. She divided the empire into provinces with standardized laws and governance systems. The reforms aimed to enhance control over distant territories and prevent future uprisings. Yet these measures also created stricter surveillance and punishment structures, especially for those accused of political dissent or betrayal. By the 1780s, Catherine had built one of the most centralized and powerful monarchies in Europe. She maintained close ties with European courts, pursued modernization projects, and expanded her empire's influence in the Mediterranean and Central Asia. Her image as a rational and strong ruler impressed foreign observers, but domestically, her rule depended on fear, order, and obedience. Her policies toward rebels and traitors grew increasingly severe over time. The Siberian frontier, with its vast frozen landscapes, became a symbol of exile and punishment. The Tsarist regime viewed Siberia as both a prison and a tool of deterrence. It was distant enough to isolate offenders and harsh enough to serve as a warning to others. Under Catherine's reign, the practice of sending political prisoners to the cold northern regions became institutionalized. Rebellions, conspiracies, and acts of defiance were met with swift punishment. Those accused of treason or sedition faced imprisonment, exile, or death. While Catherine encouraged learning and debate among the elite, she silenced any challenge to imperial authority. The empire's stability depended on suppressing dissent before it could spread. Catherine also introduced measures to control information. The printing press was tightly regulated, and foreign publications deemed subversive were banned. Her state police maintained surveillance over intellectuals, clergy, and provincial leaders suspected of disloyalty. The balance between enlightenment and despotism became increasingly fragile as her empire expanded. Throughout her reign, Catherine maintained a keen interest in the welfare of the state above all else. She saw herself as the guardian of order and progress, responsible for the unity of a diverse empire. Yet, in enforcing that unity, she allowed and at times encouraged systems of punishment that relied on physical and psychological suffering. The late years of her rule saw the codification of state punishments for rebellion. Exile to Siberia became the empire's preferred method for dealing with both criminals and political opponents. The harsh climate and remote conditions turned exile into a near-death sentence. What began as imprisonment often ended in death by exposure or disease. The concept of freezing as punishment emerged during this era. It was not officially written in law, but practiced in the remote northern provinces by local authorities acting under vague imperial orders to make examples of traitors. These punishments reflected both the cruelty of the natural environment and the state's desire to assert dominance through visible suffering. Under Catherine's reign, the empire expanded geographically and culturally, but the moral cost was severe. The contrast between her enlightened reputation abroad and her government's harsh enforcement within Russia defined the paradox of her rule. Her achievements in governance, art, and diplomacy were overshadowed by the silent fear that governed her subjects. By the end of the 18th century, Catherine's empire stood vast and powerful. The capital glittered with European sophistication, while the frontiers remained places of isolation and despair. The policies she enforced would outlast her, shaping Russia's penal system for generations. The seeds of the ice tombs were planted not by accident, but by deliberate imperial design, reflecting a state where mercy was secondary to order. The penal system under Catherine the Great functioned as both a tool of control and a symbol of imperial authority. While her reign appeared progressive to the outside world, within Russia, justice was administered through rigid and often cruel means. The state equated rebellion with treason, and treason was regarded as an offense not only against the monarch, but against the divine order itself. After the Pugachev rebellion, new categories of punishment were developed for traitors and political dissidents. Exile to Siberia became the standard sentence, but for certain offenders, exile evolved into a death sentence through exposure to the elements. The empire's administrators viewed such methods as cost-effective, requiring no formal executioner, and relying instead on the unforgiving climate. The ice tombs originated in the Siberian provinces, particularly near the Yenisei and Lena rivers. Prisoners accused of treason, conspiracy, or spreading sedition were sent north during the height of winter. They were shackled in iron restraints, stripped of most of their clothing, and left chained to wooden posts or frozen ground. The process was slow, and the results were final. These punishments were not publicly declared by the imperial court, but were known among military governors and regional commandants. Orders were transmitted using vague language such as permanent removal from the rolls or subject to the frost of judgment. Such phrasing allowed officials to act with broad discretion. The Empress herself rarely gave direct commands for such acts, but tolerated their existence as necessary measures for maintaining order. Siberian winters were among the harshest on Earth. Temperatures could drop below -50 degrees Celsius. Exposure for even an hour without shelter caused frostbite, but prisoners left outdoors for days experienced a gradual freezing process that immobilized and eventually killed them. It was not a single moment of death, but a prolonged descent into stillness. quick reminder. If you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for upcoming historical content. Reports from 1776 describe a group of Cossack rebels captured near Tobolsk who were subjected to this punishment. Their limbs were bound with wet ropes that froze into rigid bands as the night progressed. By morning, the ropes had fused with their skin. Guards recorded the scene in simple terms. The bodies stiffened before sunrise, and the snow covered them without need for burial. Local officials treated the practice as both deterrence and ritual. Villagers were often forced to witness the punishment of traitors. The condemned were displayed at crossroads or along trade routes leading toward the interior. Over time, travelers began referring to these sites as ice fields or frozen crosses. The visual impact reinforced the empire's power over life and death. The prisoners chosen for the ice tombs were not limited to soldiers or rebels. Scholars accused of spreading foreign philosophies, peasants charged with defying tax laws, and even minor officials suspected of conspiracy could be subjected to the same fate. The punishment blurred distinctions between political and criminal offenses, ensuring fear across all classes. Documentation from the Chita region mentions that guards were instructed to preserve the bodies intact until spring thaw, allowing others to see the results for months. This method served administrative as well as psychological purposes. The empire did not need monuments or prisons to remind its subjects of loyalty. Nature itself became the executioner. Some provincial governors attempted to formalize these practices into law, but the imperial administration preferred ambiguity. Officially, Catherine's government denied knowledge of such punishments, framing them as excesses of local authority. Unofficially, they continued with tacit approval, as long as order was maintained and no scandal reached the capital. The frozen dead were not buried according to Christian rites. Many were left standing, their chains frozen into the ground. When the spring thaw arrived, their remains were collected and thrown into nearby rivers. The permafrost preserved some bodies for years, and explorers decades later found bones still wrapped in rusted shackles near abandoned outposts. Catherine's officials justified the severity of Siberian punishments through administrative reports. They argued that rebellion endangered the entire empire, and mercy would encourage further uprisings. The Council of State in 1779 issued a memorandum stating, "Punishment must equal the magnitude of betrayal." That philosophy guided every aspect of the penal system. Conditions in regular Siberian prisons were themselves brutal. Prisoners endured overcrowding, starvation, and disease. Those sentenced to forced labor in the mines rarely survived more than a few years. Compared to that, the ice tombs were seen as expedient and final. They required no maintenance, no guards after the first night, and no formal execution procedure. Military officers stationed in Siberia kept detailed records of these punishments for internal communication. A 1783 letter from an officer in Irkutsk described a group of 23 rebels bound to posts along the riverbank. They were still alive when night fell. Their voices lessened with the frost. By dawn, silence remained, and their eyes reflected the snow. Such descriptions were written without emotion, reflecting bureaucratic detachment. The empire's censorship system ensured that these events remained hidden from the European public. Foreign ambassadors and travelers were shown only the civilized aspects of Catherine's reign. The hermitage, the academies, and the reformed administration projected an image of enlightenment. The suffering in Siberia was known only to those who served there or heard the rumors whispered among the lower classes. Over time, the ice tombs became part of regional folklore. Locals claimed to hear the creaking of frozen chains during the coldest nights. Travelers avoided certain valleys, believing them cursed. The empire, however, regarded such tales as useful. Superstition maintained control where direct oversight was impossible. Fear of divine punishment reinforced obedience to imperial authority. By the late 1780s, the number of exiles increased sharply, as Catherine expanded her control into the Polish territories and the Caucasus. The ice tombs continued as a hidden yet effective form of punishment. The method required no written record, and most who suffered it were already erased from official lists. Their existence disappeared with the snow that covered their bodies. The moral dimension of such punishments remained largely unexamined by contemporary officials. In a state built on hierarchy and discipline, human suffering was a necessary instrument. The empire valued loyalty over compassion, obedience over individual rights. The ice tombs represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. While Catherine's reign is remembered for its reforms, diplomacy, and cultural achievements, the machinery of punishment formed the foundation upon which her empire rested. The frozen silence of Siberia reflected the silence expected of her subjects. Those who spoke against the crown risked joining the ranks of the unrecorded dead, preserved in ice and forgotten by history. The ice tombs symbolized a state that combined Enlightenment ideals with absolute power. They revealed the contradiction at the heart of Catherine's rule, a government that spoke of reason but acted through fear. In the frozen provinces, where temperature and authority were equally merciless, the boundaries between law and cruelty disappeared entirely. The ice tombs did not end with Catherine's death in 1796. The practice, though never codified in law, survived as a regional method of punishment throughout the early 19th century. Her successors, including Paul I and Alexander I, continued to exile political dissidents to Siberia, maintaining the same infrastructure of control that she had established. The system evolved into a central feature of Russian governance: punishment through distance, silence, and climate. Records from the early 1800s indicate that the ice tombs gradually merged into the broader framework of forced labor colonies. While exposure was less frequently ordered, the conditions remained fatal. Prisoners tasked with mining salt, cutting timber, or building fortifications often froze during transport or succumbed to the cold while working. The empire's reliance on Siberia as a space for punishment persisted for centuries, reinforcing Catherine's model of deterrence through environment. European observers only began learning of these methods in the mid-19th century, when travel accounts and exiled writers described the realities of Siberian imprisonment. They revealed that the line between exile and execution was often indistinguishable. Many of those sentenced for treason never arrived at their designated settlements. The phrase "sent north" became synonymous with disappearance. Historians later interpreted the ice tombs as an extension of Catherine's broader administrative philosophy. She believed that order required constant visibility of authority. In the vast territories of Russia, that visibility often took the form of public punishment. The empire's vastness allowed cruelty to remain unseen by the capital, while its effects rippled through generations. Archaeological findings in modern Siberia have uncovered evidence consistent with contemporary reports. Near the ruins of 18th-century guard posts, iron shackles and skeletal remains have been found fused into frozen soil. These discoveries confirm that exposure was used intentionally as a method of death. Local archives, when compared with imperial decrees, reveal systematic correspondence between St. Petersburg and Siberian governors about the handling of irrecoverable prisoners. Catherine's reforms in education, law, and governance are still studied for their influence on Russia's modernization. Yet the same reign that promoted enlightenment also institutionalized cruelty as a means of unity. Her government's duality, progressive in language, authoritarian in execution, became a defining feature of Russian autocracy. The empire's later rulers inherited both the sophistication of her court and the severity of her punishments. The ice tombs stand today as a historical reminder of how power can use environment as an instrument of control. No monuments mark their existence, and no official decrees acknowledge them, yet their memory survives in oral histories and regional folklore. They represent a chapter in which nature was weaponized by the state, transforming the landscape itself into a silent execution ground. In the history of Catherine's Russia, the ice tombs symbolize the cost of empire: progress purchased through human suffering, order maintained through fear, and the frozen silence of justice carried out beneath the northern sky.